Good morning and good evening, I should say as well. I know we have participants from various time zones tuned in today. I can see they're clicking in as we speak. And welcome to this webinar. It's hosted by New York-based American Interlink and CluedIn partner. My name is Ole Noertoft. You can ask questions online as we go along, and we'll try to answer them at the end. It will also be recorded, and we'll share it afterwards. I will shortly hand over to the data privacy expert, Debbie Reynolds. She is the CEO and Chief Data Privacy Officer at Debbie Reynolds Consulting. You can see attendees are still coming in, but maybe we give it a few more seconds. She will walk you through 5 dangerous CCPA myths, but also very important key strategies for compliance success. After Debbie's part, Tim Ward, the CEO of CluedIn, will take over. He will show you how the CluedIn unifying data hub can solve some of the more complex data challenges. And that's, of course, especially this webinar is in how enterprises are dealing with CCPA compliance. The floor is yours, Debbie. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Ola, and thank you so much, Tim, for joining us on this webinar. I'm very excited to do this webinar. I feel as though, a lot of us have seen tons of advertisements or tons of webinars or even white papers about CCPA. We wanted to shake things up today and do something a little bit different, talking about things from our experience in terms of how we consult with clients about dealing with data and handling regulatory challenges with data privacy laws like the CCPA. So this again is about not being a CCPA failure and looking at as Ola said, the 5 dangerous myths and talking about key strategies for compliance success. As Ola said, I am the CEO and Chief Data Privacy Officer at Debbie Reynolds Consulting. I am a data geek, a data nerd. I have many years of experience in handling data in all different types of spheres, including education and legal, and all types of different corporations or corporate environments around the world. And I do a lot of consulting and advisory to organizations having to do with data privacy, data and legal, data and technology, and things like cybersecurity, cyberspace. All right, and then Tim, we are going to have Tim Ward, very, very nice, smart guy, CEO of CluedIn. He has tons of years of experience in engineering, so he has a very beautiful mind, as we should say, Tim. And so after I go through some of the myths about CCPA, Tim will do the demonstration of CluedIn. So the agenda today is going to be talking about California and high points about the CCPA. We're going to go through all the 5, what I call the dangerous myths. We're going to talk about key strategies for compliance, and then we're going to get into looking at the technology. All right, so key facts about California and the California Consumer Privacy Act. I like to start my discussion about CCPA at a very high level. So I'd like to talk about the influence of California. I've heard many people say, well, California is just one state in the US, they can't influence a lot of other states. And I just disagree with this immensely. California is considered the 5th largest economy in the world. 1 in 8 people in the US are Californians. Many people may not realize that in 2003, California was the first state to have a data breach notification law. And now, as of last year, all 50 states in the US have data breach notification laws, but they're on state levels and they're all different. So companies are very concerned, not only in the US, but companies that do business with any companies in the US, that instead of the U.S. having a federal data privacy law or something akin to the GDPR and the EU, that every state will pass their own types of privacy laws, kind of like what's happening now, starting again with the state of California being a very influential state in that regard. It Many other states have certain types of privacy laws. The CCPA is very different, where it's not looking at data by particular sectors or particular types of data. And also, the state of California, like the EU, has in their constitution that privacy is a fundamental human right. So it makes sense that California would have been one of the first states to try to have more comprehensive data privacy legislation. Also, Silicon Valley is in California, so a lot of the technologies that we use and love today are based out of California or out of the West Coast, including major entertainment industries or entertainment companies. So I think understanding the influence of California will sort of help bridge the gap with people understanding why we're all talking about CCPA and also the impacts on other states and other places in the US. All right, at a high level, the uh, uh, California Consumer Privacy Act is enacted to protect consumers' data privacy rights if the person is a resident of California, as it applies to the tax code of California. It is applied to for-profit businesses. Businesses have to comply with updating their privacy policies to talk about how they handle consumer data. The purpose of CCPA not only to protect data, but provide transparency to consumers about data that is bought, sold, or used regarding to them. So CCPA has opt-out requirements, and this is very different from the GDPR and the EU, where they have opt-in requirements. The CCPA also gives consumers a right to ask for, in some cases, erasure of their data. This is a little bit different in the EU, where citizens can not only ask for erasure, but possibly correction or changes to their data. The CCPA doesn't allow for that currently. Also, it has a broad definition of personal data, which some people think may be too broad. And of course, there are going to always be folks that are trying to narrow that definition, because as the broader the definition is, the more companies that are impacted. The CCPA also has something in it called data subject to access requests. So this language is directly from the EU's GDPR, which means that a person can make a request of a company about the data that the company has on them, and the company has certain obligations to the consumer to provide information about that data that they have about them. The CCPA is somewhat prescriptive in terms of saying how they have to communicate with consumers, or how they have to give avenues for consumers to make these requests, and also time frames for when they need to be able to respond to requests. So the part about CCPA, and the reason why we're all talking about CCPA, is because CCPA has a private right of action in addition to civil penalties. So for example, consumers have a right where they can sue, and they could possibly have redress or get money back from these cases or these incidents where uh, companies are not handling their data the way that they say that they're handling it. And also, the Attorney General in the state of California can put forward cases and have civil penalties on companies all the way up to $7,500 per incident. It's going to remains to be seen how per incident will be calculated. People are really concerned, as you know, per incident can mean anything. So not necessarily per person. Let's say, for instance, a consumer has given their data several times to a person, or a company has sold their data several times. Per incident can really get very costly if the math works out that way. Also, the CCPA is currently the most comprehensive data privacy law in the US. Because the US doesn't have a federal data privacy law or any legislation currently that is as broad as comprehensive as CCPA, a lot of companies who have data, they're basically preparing, or they're operating their businesses or making business changes to align with CCPA, even if they are not directly required to comply with it.
Debbie, Ole here, a question.
Yes.
How do you see the fines that we could expect under the CCPA compared to GDPR? Is it almost the same, or do you think that GDPR fines are higher or lower than CCPA, or is not something you can really say yet?
Well, I think it's going to depend on how the per incident penalties are going to get calculated by the state of California, the AG. I think most companies are more concerned. The private right of action is a concern because they feel as though this is going to spur a lot of class action lawsuits. So let's say lawsuits where many consumers are going after companies and saying, on behalf of the millions of consumers um, that we have in California that use XYZ service, we want to file this case. So I think that the maybe the aggravation of handling class action, possibly lawsuits having to do with CCPA, and then just the volume of information that the companies have to be able to gather and be able to give to individuals is sort of creating or increasing the internal sort of costs and headaches to companies to try to comply in a proactive sense. So getting ready for the possibility that you'll have these requests. But as we've seen in other state laws, like I'll just maybe a shout out for Illinois. We have a biometric privacy act here, and there was a recent class action case there that was settled with Facebook, where they paid $550 million to settle this case because they were calculating the per incident um, uh, cost or harm to the consumer at a like per image. Their incident calculation was like per image, so like thousands of images per person per at that time 12 million people in the state of Illinois who use Facebook. It was like an exorbitant amount. So once these fines are calculated, especially on the amount of consumers that are possibly impacted, the fines could be astronomical in my view.
Okay, makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much for clarifying.
All right. So I like unicorns, but we're in business, so we have to have a reality check here. I want to talk about the 5 dangerous CCPA myths that I see people talking about and thinking about, and want to dispel those myths for people as much as possible. So myth number 1 is that CCPA does not apply to my business. So when people talk about CCPA, I hear a lot of people say, "Woo, my company may not have, gross revenue of over, $25 million. I don't consider myself as quote unquote doing business in the state of California. We may have personal information of less than 50,000 customers, and we don't particularly sell data." So if you look more deeply into the CCPA and how they define all these things, CCPA applies to a lot more companies than they may even believe. So doing business in California is for some people is a fuzzy concept, but if you look more deeply into the CCPA, doing business could mean as much as, let's say, any part of a customer transaction that you have goes through or has some touch point in the state of California that may make you susceptible to CCPA. Also, I've seen some people say that you have to meet all three of these major criteria about gross revenue, the number of consumers, and then being able to sell 50% of the data. But if you look more closely into the text of CCPA, all you have to do is apply, or only one of these things have to apply to you before CCPA applies to you. The one that is most troubling or concerning, and the reason why people may not understand that CCPA applies to them, is because of the way that customer records may be calculated. So a lot of times people think about CCPA, they're thinking about, oh, well, I don't have 50,000 customers, period. But do you have 50,000? Is your product or service touching 50,000 households, not only consumers or devices? So when we get into devices, devices can be things like a smart thermostat. It could be phones. Let's say someone, just for example, let's say you have Netflix, you have it on many different devices in your home. All those things count towards this 50,000 customer record total. So let's say if you have a household that has, 5 or 10 devices, if you do the math on that, you can get to this 50,000 personal records pretty quickly. So CCPA applies to a ton more businesses that may think that it doesn't apply to them, but then also as an underlying undercurrent of this, what we're seeing is that companies that have CCPA exposure are changing some of their contracts or the way that they're engaging with other supply chain businesses to say, even though you as a business may not have any CCPA exposure, because we as a business have it, we want to make sure that you understand and can align with our business practice changes around how we deal with customer data and get you to agree with this. Also, we're seeing some companies having barriers to entering certain markets or certain companies if these companies that have CCPA exposure feel as though these suppliers don't understand their regulatory obligations or concerns. So it goes a lot farther than the text reads in the CCPA. So many other businesses that you wouldn't even think about are thinking along these terms. I'm seeing in other states as I'm traveling around, they are changing their business operations to align with CCPA, meaning that they're trying to get their customer data ready in a way that if it ever came to a point where they had a data subject access request, that they can comply. They're trying to do this type of categorization of data that is typically asked for in CCPA. I'm also seeing companies putting, buttons or putting text on their websites that have nothing to do with the state of California, saying that customers can request their data. All right. All right. CCPA myth number 2. CCPA deadline has not arrived yet. This is so not true. So the CCPA law went into effect this January 1st, 2020. The law was passed in 2018, so there was a transition period in there. People get confused about the dates because the way it was written was, this action is going to happen, 90 days, 6 months after, some other action. So to clear up all the confusion about the dates, CCPA law is in effect right now. It went into effect January 1st. The enforcement of CCPA, meaning the Attorney General has like a 6-month grace period where they're not going to start going after companies for CCPA compliance until July 1st of 2020. So in some ways, companies are feeling like the real deadline for CCPA compliance is July 1st, 2020. However, In terms of the Attorney General, the compliance is retroactive to January 1st. So any issue that has happened with a business from January 1st, 2020 until July 1st is still fair game. So you can't assume or can't plan your business around the fact that the enforcement doesn't start to July 1st when they can go after things that happen between January 1st to July 1st. Also, in the CCPA, there's a look back period. So, for example, if a consumer makes a access data subject access request of you, they are allowed to ask for up to 6 months prior, I'm sorry, 12 months prior information about your handling of data. So again, this all goes to the point of being proactive about getting into compliance. Also, there may be a little bit of confusion because people are still making proposed revisions to CCPA. My advice to clients is you should follow CCPA as it is, written right now, and don't worry about kind of the proposed revisions in the future, because whatever revisions happen in the future, there will be a time period for you to be able to incorporate that. But the CCPA isn't going to get bigger, it may get smaller. So companies that are well positioned to comply with CCPA as it is written now will be in good shape to handle any future revisions.
Debbie, Ole, again,
Yes.
a question. Is it your feeling that there will be big changes coming, or will it just be smaller adjustments, or could people risk now that they go into a huge compliance work and then, yeah, as you mentioned, it will be reduced, but is it going to be smaller changes, or how do you see it going forward?
I don't think, in terms of the structure of CCPA, I personally don't feel like the changes are going to be so monumental where you would have lost your work that you've done thus far with CCPA. I think the adjustments are going to be sort of within the framework of what the law is right now. So again, I feel like people are trying to make it a bit smaller in some ways, or to make it easier for people to do this compliance. But I personally don't feel like the revisions are going to be something where, that you either have to wait until those revisions happen to start your CCPA work, or that the work that you've done thus far to comply is going to be lost because of these future revisions.
And
Does
and
that
again, I guess it could also spread to other states anyway. It will spread to other states, so it's not, yeah,
Right,
it's not
exactly.
one solution fits all.
I think that I heard that they're currently, as of a couple weeks ago, there are 23 other states that are looking to pass laws similar to CCPA. So it's definitely not stopping, because CCPA was the first law for, because California was the first state to do this. A lot of other states are looking towards the CCPA, and a lot of businesses operationally, because it's a pain for them in a lot of ways to try to just carve out um, residents in the state of California. For them on the operational side, it makes sense for them to be able to do this for other states, whether, again, they may not be legally obligated to do so, but a lot of companies are preparing on the back end of the way that they handle their data, if it should happen that they can actually comply with those requests. And we're seeing some companies that are voluntarily saying we're extending these rights to all other U.S. states. So Microsoft, I think, is one. PayPal, I think, is one that's saying that as well. All right. Uh, One other thing I want to add is that there are certain industry groups. I think there are people in maybe content marketing, I believe, that were sending letters to the California State Attorney General asking for postponement in the enforcement phase of CCPA, and currently no postponements have been approved. So, we need to all work forward with the law as it is now, and then as any other changes happen in the future, we can deal with that. But I think waiting to try to see what's going to happen next is probably going to put you in a much worse position as a business owner or someone who's in charge of compliance at a business to comply with CCPA.
And it's a dangerous strategy maybe because there's a look back period, a charge back period.
Exactly. Absolutely. So, all right. Myth number 3. We only need a privacy policy update for CCPA. This is totally a myth. Totally not true. Companies have a lot of obligations under CCPA, and I'm seeing not only companies in the state of California, but also companies in a lot of other states are doing things like they're putting buttons on their website, opt-out buttons to say, "Do not sell my personal information." For example, I am in the state of Illinois, and I saw on the Illinois state license website they have the "Do not sell my personal information" button. So now the state of Illinois has no obligation to do this under the law. Obviously they're Illinois, not California, but I'm seeing a lot of companies really preparing their operations in a way that they can actually comply with these types of requests if they should come in, and if other states start to follow the lead of California with the CCPA. Some companies think that if you sell data, and obviously CCPA would apply to you, but it's also companies that buy data. But in addition to that, companies need to affirm or deny whether they sell data or not. So let's say, for instance, your company doesn't sell data, or doesn't sell data in the way that you think the definition of sale is defined in the CCPA. uh, Consumers can still make those requests of you if you consider, quote unquote, doing business in the state of California. And you may have to affirm or deny that you do or do not sell information. So that makes like an additional compliance issue that people have to think about. So you may be in jeopardy because you're not responding to consumers, even if it is just to say that we do not sell your data. Businesses have within 45 days to respond to a request. There's also, I think, a clause in there that says that, let's say you feel as though you need an extension, you have to let them know within that 45-day period, I believe, that you need an extension to comply with their request. But that extension will be no more than 90 days. So there are a lot of little um, sort of time or reporting requirements having to do with CCPA. And I feel like a lot of businesses are sort of putting, the best face that they can on being able to comply with the CCPA, and having the buttons on their website and tracking the requests. So there is a time limit in there that companies need to really think about, because I feel as though that's probably something that the Attorney General will go after companies for, not being able to comply or reply to consumer requests within a timely manner. All right. Business must locate and report on consumer data. This is probably the toughest things that businesses have to deal with when they think about CCPA, because a lot of data that they have may be in silos, and they may be hard. Let's say, companies have all these different business units. They have all these different types of technologies that they're using across the enterprise, and they never thought that they would ever have to have the type of transparency that a law like the CCPA is requesting. So companies are having a lot of trouble locating this customer data and being able to do things like categorize the specifics, categorize the information they have about consumers, and if possible, if the consumer is asking for a report of that, giving them the data specifics. Businesses must delete certain data upon request. This is another challenge that companies have. In addition to finding the data, once if a consumer asks for their data to be deleted, how the companies delete it, be able to keep records of it in a way that makes sense and complies with the CCPA. These are, I feel, are the biggest challenges that companies are having with the CCPA. So in addition to being concerned about the number of consumers that may be asking for their data back, being able to actually execute on these requests in terms of finding the data, reporting back to consumers on the data, and deleting it, I feel are some of the biggest challenges that businesses have today regarding the CCPA. And this goes way beyond just updating your privacy policy. All right. All right. Myth number 4, we do not sell data, so CCPA does not apply. This is a huge myth. I recommend that anyone, if you read nothing else in the CCPA, you should really read the definition of sell in the CCPA. This has been a point of contention, and it's also been controversial because sell means many different things. I think that companies early on were asking for more guidance on how the CCPA defines sell, and sell is very broad here. So sell can mean selling, buying, renting, disclosing, disseminating, transferring, communicating in writing, orally, electronically about a person's information with another business or third party for monetary or other valuable consideration. So I tell clients when they're if they're confused about whether they sell data or not, I ask them simple questions like, do you have consumer data? Most of them say yes. Do you share that data with anyone outside of your company? So, and the answer a lot of times is yes, because for example, not every company does every function under their own roof. So they may have third parties they're sharing information with. They may be, asking for help in managing their data. So they have to really think more broadly about the terminology within the CCPA as it relates to selling. If there is any type of valuable consideration or monetary consideration with a third party, you may fall under the category of having sold data under the CCPA. And I think that this is going to play itself out in these cases that we see, but I always recommend that companies be more conservative. So if you are in doubt or you are not sure whether you sell data or not, you need to position yourself in a way that you can answer questions if being asked by consumers or the attorney general about how how you do your business and how you handle consumer data, even if you don't feel as though the definition of sell exactly fits your operation. All right. Myth number 5, complying with CCPA is easy. So people sometimes are concerned that the CCPA is very prescriptive. Sometimes people are thinking about CCPA on the surface level. So I feel as though companies are very attuned to being able to put buttons on their website to make people make consumer or DSAR requests, but it goes a lot deeper than that. So it's businesses really must change the way they operate. So if businesses aren't creating enough transparency with how they're handling consumer data and the way that they operate day to day, those things really are going to have to change. And that may, especially if you're a consumer focused business, that may touch almost any level of your organization and how you attain or retain a customer, how their data travels through your organization, what third parties that it touches, how you disseminate this information, and being able to make sure that your policies and procedures match what you're actually doing in your operation. So you definitely don't want to say that you handle data a certain way and then not do it. So it's really important that the communication to consumers about how you handling data is accurate to the way that you're operating your business. Um, Data silos are common. I feel as though this is so common that we're just accustomed to it now, where companies have data in so many different locations and different agencies or different departments within companies handle data in different ways. So it causes major challenges in locating, reporting, and deleting consumer data. And we're still seeing, even with a lot of technologies out there, people are still doing a lot of manual work to comply with data subject access requests related to finding consumer data and making it more transparent to the user. So complying with CCPA is definitely not easy. It's definitely a challenge that people are having. I feel as though the data silos not only impacts like data privacy, but the data silo issue goes across organizations in many different ways. So I feel as though being able to attack the data silo issue and be able to reduce some of the manual work that is happening is a benefit, not only in a data privacy sense, but just in a data operations sense if you are handling consumer data at all. All right. So now I think I'm going to turn it over to Tim Ward, who's the CEO of CluedIn, and he'll talk about the key strategy for compliance success. As I said before, one of the problems with CCPA compliance is finding the data, and then we have Tim who can talk more about that. Tim?
Thank you so much, Debbie, and thank you very much for the warm introduction there before as well. Very much appreciated. So as well, thank you for everyone for being here as well. And as Debbie alluded to before, whereas Debbie focused on a lot of the structure of the CCPA, some of the rules, some of the things that we need to watch out for. My main goal for the next part of the webinar is really to focus on the technology pieces and some of the points around data silos and that it covers multiple different spectrums of problems, not only the privacy piece itself, is really what I'm wanting to break down and analyze with you over the next 25 minutes. So let's just dive in. I think from a technology aspect, if I was to break down what Debbie said into kind of some core main pillars of privacy, it goes without saying that whether this is GDPR in the EU, or whether it is CCPA, whether it is the Philippines Act, the Australian Act, the bottom line is the majority of core pillars comes down to starting with what data do you have? And really this at the surface level probably seems like something that is achievable in a manual mapping process to be able to catalog the types of systems that you have. So then it's complicated by the fact that where is this data stored? And as we move more into SaaS applications, into cloud, then suddenly the control of where that data is stored physically becomes a little bit hard to control. So then we add the complexity of how and when did we actually obtain this data? And that really comes back to that lineage piece that Debbie was touching on. Where did the data come from? What's happened to in the process? And where is it being used throughout the business? As you can probably allude to, a lot of more businesses are wanting to become a lot more data-driven in nature. And as we give that data out to the business, how can we make sure that we have some type of control in place? So then we head into the why do you have the data? This is where we start touching on things like consent. So how have you as a business captured the consent? And as Debbie alluded to, opt-in, opt-out, there are different setups across the different regulations. But do you actually have the consent to do what you're doing with that personal data? The next pillar is actually something that I would say enterprises to some degree have been focusing a lot on without the privacy pieces. This more falls under the governance banner of data. So who has access to the data? And there are many systems to help large businesses in navigating this complex landscape of permissions and access. In adding on top of the why do you have the data, the consent piece, if you look at some of the regulations, you dive into some of the wording, what becomes apparent is that, well, we start to to really not have the ability to capture global consent. We need to have specific consent for specific purposes. And whether this is for processing data for an automatic loan approval, whether it's for something as simple as HR data for employees, we need to make sure that we're capturing the consent for these individual use cases. Is the data secure? This comes in many facets. Is the security there at rest of data? Is it at transport of data? Is it at consumption of data? And you can see a lot of vendors like ourselves, but also businesses doing a lot of work to make sure they're meeting industry standards for encryption, for transport of data. So how does the data travel through your system? This is really where we start to touch again on that data lineage piece. But to be honest, it also starts to delve into things like data auditing, data trust. So how do I know where the data come from? What's happened to it in the meantime of getting it to the point where we're consuming it? And of course, where are we using this? So this not only has a data privacy knock on, but it has that, how do I gain trust in the data that we are utilizing for different use cases across the business? And finally, what we would class as data sovereignty is the concept of, does data ever cross international borders? Once again, as we get into the cloud, this becomes an even harder and harder thing to manage. So I wanted to take you through the kind of technical background and infrastructure that's needed to really attack this problem from a solutions perspective. And one of the things that we're really not wanting to do is provide surface level solutions. You know, Excel sheet mappings, although a good practice when you think about some of the complexities that Debbie was talking about, such as the right for deletion, the right for portability, these surface level solutions will often not really go far in actually fulfilling the regulations themselves. So one of the first places that it starts is this data silo kind of problem that Debbie alluded to. You know, I've got different operational systems. Some are easier to manage than others. Some are in the realm of structured data, and then others are a little bit more complex. They're in the realm of either semi-structured or unstructured data. Something like an email body would be a good example of something that's quite unstructured. And so really what we need to start looking at to start this journey is data integration. How can I analyze, how can I scan, how can I ingest the data from all the different operational systems without me needing to personally have to map where all of this PII data is? So really the main value is here is, you know, can technology support you in being able to scan the many different operational systems that you have? And at CluedIn, at last count, we have just over 220 pre-built connectors to quite common enterprise pieces of software. So touching on the personally identifying data piece, it turns out that there is a lot of PII that falls under both the CCPA and the GDPR that has some type of structure. Phone numbers is a good example. Social security numbers, passport numbers. In Denmark, we have what's called CPR numbers, very similar to social security numbers. And they have a very well-defined structure. And that's the part of the process that, from a technology aspect, is not too hard to solve. Looking for patterns in data is something, as you can imagine, that computers are quite good for. But what about the PII that doesn't have patterns? Some simple examples would be job titles. There are new job titles coming up every single day. As technology advances, this is one of the causes of new technology, is there are new positions. You know, for example, in my field, if I look at the field of data engineering, that kind of title didn't exist many years ago, and technology drives that forward. So really, technology can be used today to detect those PII elements that aren't necessarily matching certain patterns. And I'll just reiterate that job titles is just a really good example, something that doesn't have necessarily a pattern in it. So Debbie talked about two very complex pieces of the challenge: breaking down data silos, but actually fulfilling these subject access requests and these right for portability, and what is probably the hardest thing to achieve, right for deletion and right for mutation. So whether that's anonymizing data, pseudonymizing it, deleting it, rectifying it, or minifying it, this is where really the complexity comes in. So first of all, one of the things to know is, a dashboard of what are the subject access requests that are currently in process within your system. And if we take a look at CluedIn, when we give our customers the ability to start brand new subject access requests, you can probably imagine that some of the first things we're doing is starting to ask the user, you need to give some type of personal identifiers to look up across the different systems. And once that's done, we need to generate our portability request, essentially an aesthetically pleasing report, whether this is PDF or something printable, that we can send to the subject based off their request, i.e., I'd like all the data that's personally identifying. I'd like all the records that allude to my identification, which is one of the complexities in this space, that ability that does this elude, or can I use multiple different pieces of data in combination to actually lead to the identification of an individual? And of course, one of the other important things from a technology aspect is, can I actually do this electronically? So we call this a data controller export, where essentially can we, from a machine readable format, send this data to potentially another data controller, which, as you will may or may not know, is definitely part of the GDPR and also part of the CCPA. So this is one of the biggest challenges when it comes to a proper privacy solution: duplicate records. How do we know that these three people are the same or not? And how do we actually give the tools to be able to, once identified, take them through a process where they can actually go through and form a unified view of an individual? After all, you can probably imagine that if I searched for Debbie within our systems, I'm not really wanting 15, 20, 25 different records where here's Debbie in our mail system, here's Debbie in our webinar system, here's Debbie in, for example, our contacts. I want a single view, so therefore I can put through that portability request for her. Now, to the point where it becomes tricky. If Debbie was to come back and say, hey guys, I would, now that I've seen my data, now that you've given me the nice PDF report, I would like to action this. And as you're probably all aware of, there are many different types of actions that can be done. Things like anonymization, pseudonymization, or masking of the data. Things like deletion and rectification. So one of the things that's nice about mapping all of the data from the operational systems is that if we've mapped that into a single view of Debbie, then you probably get the concept that we can unmap that, i.e., if we need to rectify Debbie's data, we now have that lineage or that audit trail of, well, where did all this data come from? So when it comes to the ability to then ask all these operational systems to action this, whether that's deletion or anonymization, we have those links available. We know where those records came from, and we know the exact data that we actually need to mutate in those source systems. So something as simple as rectification. In my world, this is very similar to editing of data or updating records. Just the ability to go to an individual record and update it from one single place and have that replay onto the operational systems, you can start to see the value of technology when it comes to using it in the case of data privacy. And whether this rectification or whether this is minimization. Now, what are the subtle differences here? Essentially what this is if we're tracking what we have consent for and what data we have, Minification is the act of deleting all the data that you don't have consent for. You can probably imagine that having the ability to map that consent in a platform against the data makes it rather easy for us to then know what are we allowed to keep versus what are we not allowed to keep. When it comes down to minification, it would be we only can keep the stuff that we have consent for. So we call this our single view of a record. And we can take Lars here, for example. This is a view of his record. This is the data connected to his record. So in that last activities widget, you can actually see that, okay, here's some communication that we've had back and forth within Office 365. We can look on the left-hand side to see some of the metadata. We can also drill into some of that metadata to see more details. But one of the things about data, one of the use cases that's quite popular in this space is building a single view of the customer, sometimes also referred to as a 360 view, sometimes for industries like banks, often referred to as KYC, know your customer. So it turns out from a technical aspect that a lot of the building blocks of those use cases are actually the same building blocks of something like solving data privacy and some of the complexities behind it, such as reporting all data on an individual and then being able to delete or rectify that data as well. One of the things that we often talk with our customers about is trust in data. Now, whether this is the use case of data privacy or whether it's as simple as something like business intelligence, reports, pie charts showing the distribution of where our customers are or where the businesses that we partner with are. To get that trust, a lot of that comes from the ability to trace back the sources of where you got that data. And whether that's internal systems or, as Debbie alluded to, external data sources that a lot of companies are using. Obviously, when Debbie talked about the fact that, are you selling your data? Well, there's also the other side, which is, are you buying sold data from distributors? And this is very common in the enterprise to do this. For me, it's all about that lineage, to be able to prove where did we get this data from and how has it flown through the system to get to the point where we're utilizing that data for use cases. Now, not all businesses are created equally. Different industries, whether it's different countries, states, cities, all have different interpretations of the regulations themselves. And really then it comes down to the ability to give these companies the ability to build rules up on what they are wanting to do with private data. I'll give a simple example. Here at CluedIn, we have a policy that says there's no reason why we should have anyone's gender. Now, even with that policy in place, it doesn't mean that some operational systems won't give customers the ability to enter that. But if I'm going to use that data throughout the business, we can use simple conditions and actions to say, listen, if we ever spot someone's gender, just automatically put in an action to mask that data. And really this comes down to that ability to use your data with confidence. How can I sit back and know that if we are becoming data-driven businesses, if we are using our data to fuel use cases, can we do that with an ethical confidence that we are treating PII data with respect? Now, of course, if we are given the ability to change these within a system, we then would like the ability to have a system facilitate how that operation or change in data can make its way back to the operational systems. We call this our mesh API. Think of it as a way to centrally orchestrate deletion, rectification, minification, and all of those kind of mutation demands that come from things like rights for portability and rights for deletion. Now, something that enterprises have been doing for many years, retention. What are the laws around how long they can keep certain pieces of data for? And one of the funny things about a lot of operational systems, a lot of these siloed tools is a lot of them don't support retention by default. They might have systems like Office 365 that supports retention. Great. They might have built an inbuilt tool or used a SaaS application that's quite new that most likely is not going to have these types of systems in place. But it is mandated, and it is very much part of the regulations that we need to have some type of control over retention. So with CluedIn, we have the ability to actually centrally orchestrate that retention. That we will take care of how long certain data should stay in the operational systems, and then facilitate the commands back to all the operational systems to either archive and delete that data when certain schedules have been hit. The same goes for data breaches. As Debbie does, I spend a lot of my time talking with the customers. And one of the things that often surprises me is that a lot of people aren't aware that, of course, data breaches are a very common standard today. They're happening all the time. But really, once detected, you typically have around 72 hours to actually let your supervisory authority know that a breach has happened, when it happened, and who was involved and affected by that breach. So having technology be there to support those types of mechanisms comes back to utilizing your data with confidence. Data sovereignty is the idea of how do I know if my data is traveling internationally across borders? And in traditional types of ways and traditional types of systems, on-premise environments, you could argue this becomes less of an impact. But as soon as we introduce any tooling, such as email systems, messaging systems, really we're starting to fall for the same types of issues as if we were fully cloud-based operational companies. And so having the ability for technology to track where the data is being at rest, where it is being utilized throughout the business, can once again have you sit back and say, listen, if we are audited, if the day comes where a protection agency says, I would like to see how you operate with your data, these are the types of things that they'll be looking for. And if you've got these types of systems in place, really it comes down to you've put in a lot of effort to make sure you ethically control and look after the data of your customers. So I give full disclosure for my personal data on this. And what I'm trying to show here is that one of the complexities is that I have multiple different identifiers. I have my public addresses, I have my private email addresses, I have phone numbers now and in the past. My name is Tim Ward, but my full name is Timothy. So these are all identifiers or aliases for essentially the same person. And really what you're wanting in technology to drive this data privacy piece is that when I look for a particular person, I want to make sure all of that problems of duplicate records or records that could be the same person, but I don't know if it is, that it's taken care of. As you can imagine, the repercussions of giving out personal data on another individual that's not the one that takes a request is probably for a business an absolute nightmare. Because we focus on large, complex businesses, you can probably imagine that to operationalize this, there's the need to sometimes automate this process. And so all of this is available via friendly to use REST APIs to allow you to really give your consumers, really give your customers, your employees, anyone that you interact with at a personal level, the full confidence that you have the technology backing to be able to fulfill any of the CCPA, GDPR, and other privacy acts around the world. So with that in mind, Ole, I will hand over to you to close the webinar.
Yes, thank you very much, Debbie and Tim. Thank you, Tim, for showing how modern tools like CluedIn can help really enterprises in a journey towards compliance. You showed us how you automatically can integrate data, detect PIIs, handle retention, run subject access requests, but also delete and change data. Debbie, thank you very much for taking us through some common misunderstandings when it comes to CCPA. clearly it's something that needs to be taken very seriously. Fines can be huge, but also company needs to establish if they actually meet just one of the thresholds you pointed out, and that could be tricky. As example, you mentioned the number of connected devices count as customer, not just the number of accounts, which I think can have some implications. Also, you mentioned that companies need to really rethink more broadly about it in definition where they're selling data or not. And if they do, then really take the necessary action towards compliance. But everybody, thank you for taking time to join this webinar. We need to close it now. We have clocked an hour. I hope you found it interesting, and feel free to reach out to any of us for additional information. As mentioned, the webinar has been recorded and we will share it widely. So yeah, and you feel free to share it among your network as well. But by this, we will close the webinar. Have a continued great day, and for somebody, evening. Take care. Bye.